Super. Okay. So, do we have anyone who wants to kick off with a question? Or if you can.
Thank you very much.
Can I just actually make a point? We have sponsors who've been presenting, but we've also got sponsorship from Boston over there as an integrator. So thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation. So my question is around, so we've got many organisations that come to us looking for Lustre solutions, and they look to deliver value for money in terms of the hardware components they buy. And historically, we build solutions maybe based on 3 copies of the data. So with large capacity solutions, that's more expenditure in terms of disks. So my question is, are there any kind of do's and don'ts when it comes to erasure coding with Lustre?
Well, I mean, so right now, Lustre depends on redundancy at the storage level, right? So either ZFS or LDiskFS plus RAID of some kind. There is work that was started a few years ago about client-side erasure coding. That hasn't been completed yet. There is some interest in completing that work at Oak Ridge is working on it. I don't have a specific timeline because they're not us, so I can't speak for them. But my understanding is they're sort of looking in the 2017 kind of time frame to implement a client-side erasure coding, and it would be the same as the file level replication that exists today, which means that the clients would be doing it, but it can be done asynchronously, right? So the design, at least that was started with, is that you could take a striped file, any striped file, and then add in, a number of erasure coded stripes as well. And so it can be done in post-processing by a different client than writes it, because for HPC that's important. You don't want to be slowing down the initial client writes. And I'm hoping at least that users don't use Lustre for transactional banking purposes, right? So having the immediate redundancy is a little bit less important than having a long-term redundancy.
Good, thank you.
Okay. And Paul, there was John, the question of the funds.
Possibly covered by your final answer there, but the client-side caching, there is a risk of an application thinking it's written and that write never getting to the file system. Is that right?
Yeah.
If the node dies before it flushes.
Yeah, that's true even with local file systems, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
If the client doesn't call fsync and wait for the response, I mean, fsync on the file will flush out that data.
Will force the flush.
Yeah.
Excellent. And how does sorry, just sneak in with another one, but you said that if somebody else or some other node tries to access a file that is currently only living in a different node's cache,
yeah.
How does anything know that that's the case?
Because it's partly because it's POSIX, right? The client that's accessing, you have a directory /A/B/C, right? The other client is going to have to start at A, which is, say the root directory. The B is the one that's created by the write-back cache. And so in order just to access that directory, we have, Lustre's cache coherent between all of the nodes. So to access that directory, the second client would need to talk to the MDS. The MDS knows that this client has an exclusive lock on that directory. And so in order to revoke the lock, everything that's at least one level down from the top level directory would get synced to disk, to the MDS, and then it would get the same type of exclusive lock on the next level of directories, C and all the C1, C2, C3. And so it would, if it's going A/B/C1/D1, E1, it would do this recursively for each of that path, but all of the other leaves would still remain in the cache. And they would be kept until either the client runs out of memory, the locks and the directories are tens of seconds old, they would get flushed by age or by contention, right? And so this has been, there was actually an interesting paper that I participated in that was presented at Supercomputing, and they did a performance analysis of this. And even with doing like untar and parallel make in a single directory tree, they still got quite a bit of performance improvement, and it's all cache coherent.
So essentially, it's not silently cached. It has notified the server, "Hey, I'm caching some stuff under this directory."
Only about the top of the directory
yes.
tree, the root, and everything underneath it's Pandora's box, or no, I guess Schrodinger's cat. We don't know. You don't know what's beyond
What might
that
be
top level directory until you look into it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's enough for for the MDS to know that there is a directory there, and that's the client is in charge.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, I guess actually another question for Andreas. You're talking about client-side compression and the growth of life science and particularly genomics workloads. Lots of those files come pre-compressed, and they're also compressed and indexable. Because often within the genome world, you just want to go, I want that bit, and you obviously don't want to work all your way through the file. And I think with some of these things, they try to push the performance up by also having predefined compression algorithms, which they just pick up, and it may not be perfect in every time, but it's not spending the time working out how to compress efficiently. Would there be a way to, if you know, perhaps by the file extension, this data should not be looked at, or this data that way?
Yeah.
People are playing a lot of tricks in the genomic space already.
Yeah, so the compression, I mean, my design philosophy or architecture philosophy is, perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And so in the first release, we'll have support for compressing the files. And because the compression is done by chunk, you'll still be able to do random access within a file, right? So you won't have to decompress the whole file in order to read, the middle 64K. But it will be doing it in a chunk size. We'll support the standard algorithms to start. I mean, I know that there are genomic-specific algorithms which we won't have support for initially. But if the file is coming in wholly compressed, we would try to do compression, so let's say for the first 10 or whatever chunks of the file, and if it's proving that everyone is incompressible, it would stop, okay. Right? And there is, we've discussed, but there isn't a plan to implement, just identifying .gz and TGZ and all of these other kinds of, MPEG, JPEG extensions and turning off compression, yeah. Right? And vice versa, if you see a .text, we might pick a stronger algorithm because we know it can be compressed very well. And so having genomic-specific ones, we haven't looked into that closely yet, but I know that those kind of algorithms exist. And so there is the flexibility within the framework to support, 256 different compression algorithms. And so we can add that in the future, potentially.
So it's the SAMTools library, so a BAM file, which is the standard for, so those are indexable, pre-compressed files, because you tend to want to look further in all the time. Thank you. We have a
question for Simon. You said that a NID isn't secure enough. When we do it, we think it is. I think it's because we use Ethernet and your IB. Is that the case?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question.
Sorry.
This was Simon. Yeah, so this is NIDs. I think, we'll put it this way, if NIDs are secure, that would be great because I can ditch 50% of my code, and that's always something I like. I think the advice that we heard generally was that if I have root, so in the data center, we hope that people don't get root. But as far as I'm aware, if you have root on a node, it is possible to construct a packet. You're going to have to dig deep. I think you can.
So you can change, if you've got root, you can change the NID, but the way we have it, we have our layer 3 router being the next hop on, and therefore it'll only route packets if it's on the right area.
So that was one piece of advice we were given. There are a number of approaches that we ditched, and I'm not sure if they were the correct decision to ditch. So Kerberos, for example, wholesale replacement of what we did. And also, the traditional way that we were advised to sort this out was to use exactly that, to use a router to preserve it.
So we don't use a Lustre router, we use the layer 3 routing thing in the switch.
Yeah, that's one of the things we wanted to avoid. So one of the reasons we chose not to trust the NIDs at all was precisely because what we wanted eventually was basically a container, drop it in, forget about it, and I don't want to care about the infrastructure. But I think just because we chose to do that, that's one of the reasons why it's an approach. definitely other ways to do it. Many of them better, as long as you're willing to suck up the pain of depending on stuff around you, which we won't.
No.
I was just going to ask Simon as well. Is any of your code actually open source or
I
releasable,
wish.
even in a dump form?
Yeah, unfortunately, no, bluntly. But you know, I think the fact that I can tell you how it works, you have my email address. No, I can't give you code, but I can certainly, you know, if you're interested, please do.
And I was going to also ask, like, are you doing any other like squashing UAD JIDs in your multi-tenancy? Or is it
We
mostly-
completely hand wave that. So in terms of authorization versus authn, you know, basically, so I'm from an object storage background. I quite like the idea that a tenant is a tenant and that's the end of it. And so we left it pretty much there. There is an LDAP, there's some UIDs and GID, we don't care. As far as we're concerned, if the tenant, everyone within it has access effectively. But I think that is something that we would be interested in general, and this is where the Kerberos thing, you know, is of interest, because there's one really good way to do that already, and that's it. But no, we didn't bother.
Cheers.
So if I recap very quickly then, Simon, so if I happen to have a very large pocket and put my hands in and pulled out enough money to buy a superpod, is this the sort of thing that if they were running the NVIDIA stack would be something that could be in that solution, or is that not your conversation?
I think, so it's not a buyable product. The superpod is certainly something you can buy. This is something that we built. At the minute, and I said that there's two versions of Cambridge One, we're describing, you know, something that we use for the first one. There's going to be a third at some point, so the stack that it runs on comes in very large marketing-y version number. And you know, I was involved in version 1, there's currently a version 2, which looks dissimilar. But version 3 looks more like that. So, you know, maybe.
Maybe.
Need lots of money though, come back later.
Very, very large pocket. Well, it's not my pocket, I should say. But I do know there are some very large pockets around. And there are particularly some problems that can't be solved without those large pockets and the commitment to go for those.
Sadly so.
Sorry, I wasn't checking if anybody else had their hands up. I was busy answering questions. We need some more.
Any more questions?
Must have more. Well, we have some polite people. I think you've answered.
Thank you. How about it's not a question, it's more an observation and a thank you. So looking at the roadmap that Andreas was presenting earlier, something that a large thing that struck me was that it seems to be a lot about making Lustre competitive with the feeling of using an SSD in a laptop. And I'd just like to say thank you very much. That's like a really, really big thing. Really big. Making my supercomputer feel like a laptop is exactly what our users will want.
And you joke about that, but that's a legitimate problem, right? That, you know, lots of, apologies, but I call it the lazy programmer model, which is that, you know, they develop some code on their laptop, literally, and then they want it to run on a supercomputer, and it has to be exactly as fast, right? And, you know, today the developer time is much, you know, is as expensive as the system time, and so, you know, having clouds of, you know, Monte Carlo kind of simulations where there's thousands of processes, but they're not coordinated like traditional HPC with MPI and barriers and things like that. And so they unleash this, you know, swarm of disparate processes on the storage, and it has to, you know, be able to manage with essentially what ends up being a denial of service.
And that's where
on the
James's
storage.
job stats presentation comes in.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's another of the life sciences trends, is that very coordinated, large-scale parallel processing. We're a high-throughput site, not a high-performance site. So putting HPC was the wrong letter. Have I got any more hands up? So when looking at trying to run this meeting, very much user, and had that at the middle of that, I wanted these to be users talking about their real life and their problems, and, you know, feedback of saying, please one thing you've got experience on, just focus on that. You can't talk about everything you do or what you do or why you do it. There'll be plenty of time, hopefully, in future meetings to talk about those. So how best do you want to get feedback from users as to what their priorities are, what they need to see Lustre do in future versions? What's your preferred way for interacting?
Well, I mean, obviously it's great at events like this. You can just talk and have a more fuller, richer discussion about it. But even just, things like the type of problems Alistair was talking about earlier on, but even just having we do monitor and engage on the Lustre Discuss mailing list. If people are sort of not quite sure what it is they're facing, and put is this right, or am I doing it right, or that kind of questions, we do kind of, Andreas in particular responds a lot on the mailing list. And then, a JIRA ticket as well, and anyone can sign up for a JIRA access and log a ticket if you do think you've identified a bug. And that includes, documentation is part of Lustre, so if there's things that are unclear or missing or wrong in the manual, then you can definitely open a ticket in the documentation project to sort of...
Or go farther and actually submit a patch. There's a section, on the Lustre wiki on how to submit changes to the documentation, and it's not impossible to do.
It's not impossible, but I understand why people don't do it, because it does involve mucking about with XML. But even just saying, that's the thing, it's a 500 plus, I've stopped counting, manual, and when we do new features, we obviously are very cognizant that this is a new section of the manual, let's make sure this makes sense to us. But then other bits can gradually sort of atrophy over time and drift out of, become less accurate. And that's much harder to catch. And also, even when you're writing docs for the first time, it makes sense to you as the author, but there may be gaps that you're mentally filling in that to somebody just coming to this new for the first time, it doesn't quite make sense, that they're missing some context that you filled in without realizing it, right? So.
The one thing you didn't mention is the survey, the user survey.
Oh yeah, the user survey. So, the survey we do have, put that every year. Do encourage you to sort of fill that out. That is super useful to get, to make sure when we're anticipating what people will need or what the focus should be, that there's some sort of data basis behind it to sort of support the decision making.
Okay, Vic.
So how do they get the user survey?
How do you get the user survey? So it will be put out on the Lustre Discuss mailing list. OpenSFS tweets it, all that kind of thing. People put it on LinkedIn. There's basically will just be a link, and it's just a simple web form to sort of complete.
So
done once a year in February, March.
February.
So one thing that will be on my list is a mailing list for the Lustre user group that I hope members would be, and then hopefully we can add that on as a way of cascading information and requests for feedback and information. I say this is very much just a first meeting to get started, but I think that having an active mailing list that keeps the UK groups talking to each other would be good. No, I thought it was Lawrence put his hand up, but he's just playing with his mobile. Okay, do we have any more questions? What are we doing time-wise? Oh, it's 10 to 5. It's almost pretty good. Are we good then? I think if we're there. In which case, I think I'll start to move to wrapping things up. Well, I think, first of all, thanks for the speakers for the second part on the developer side. Thanks again.